The United States has a relationship with Ukraine, and it has been an absolute roller coaster of a ride over the years. The difference is night and day between how Joe Biden handled Ukraine versus how President Trump is approaching it. Methinks that maybe one side wanted this war to go on, but that's cynical. That's cynical. But I think it's true. Context now is key to understanding the approaches between Biden and Trump, because so much has happened over the last 17 years, and that's really where this began. I want to start back in 2008. George W. Bush was still in office. Doesn't it seem like a zillion years ago? That's when the United States signed the Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership. This is the beginning of the unraveling with Russia. It's a very fancy pants document promising cooperation, trade, security, and democracy. Sounds great, but it is the first brick in what will become a wall of commitment. The State Department is all in, saying they stand by Ukraine as it slowly moves out of Russia's shadow. Now, they keep this formal partnership. It's still going. In fact, they upped it, and I'll tell you more about that. But keep this in mind because it is the seed for everything that follows. Now, we go to 2009. Here's another big seed. Obama is in office, and according to a State Department cable that later was turned up from WikiLeaks, the U.S. reaffirmed the support for Ukraine's bid to join NATO. So you know, when the wall came down, we promised Russia we would not do that. So they find this to be a very confusing, backstabbing, and hostile move. Doesn't okay anything that they did, but that's the way they viewed it. Now, this is coming just months after Russia's military went in and clashed in Georgia. This becomes more ammunition that Russia uses to claim that NATO is threatening its territory. Meanwhile, they're threatening other people's territory. In 2014, we have the unrest. I love this. I'm going to give you the most politically correct way. The unrest in Kyiv happens because protests just spontaneously erupt. They were kind of egged on by the U.S. State Department. And soon the pro-Russian government is forced out. And we back the new transition to a more Western-friendly government. Now, the U.S. backing this is probably the nicest and most benign way to describe that. I mean, I'm not saying that the State Department was in the area handing out sandwiches to the regime changers or doing courses with that. I'm not saying that, nor would I. And I'm not going to show you the picture of our State Department actually there handing out the sandwiches. Okay, that's the picture of our State Department handing out the sandwiches. We orchestrated all of this. So I did show you the picture, but you shouldn't show that picture to anybody else because that would be wrong. By the way, you can get the full context of this story with the Democrats' Hydra, episode 3, as part of my Ukrainian specials on BlazeTV, happened a few years ago. It's really critical that you understand this part if you really want to understand why is everybody fighting, what role do we play? We played a very big role. Now, during the first year of this new government, we sent $118 million to the new government. It was in military aid, not weapons. This is what Trump was saying to Zelenskyy recently. Obama sent you blankets. I sent you missiles. It's true, but it is the beginning of an absolute flood of money to come. Meanwhile, at the same time, Hunter Biden is suddenly handed a sweet, sweet gig that he has no business ever having. He's working now at Burisma, a Ukrainian gas company. And the only kind of gas he's ever had is the one that went, geez, Hunter, stop it. Now, even the New York Times is looking in this one at the time going, he doesn't have any experience or background in the industry of energy. But he was pulling down $50,000 a month to sit on Burisma's board at the same time that Ukraine was part of Joe Biden's assigned responsibility as the vice president. That's where everybody's like, that doesn't look right. And then what happens? About a year later, in December 2015, Joe Biden is in Kyiv where he pressures Ukraine to fire their prosecutor general, Viktor Shokin. Now, everybody at the time thinks this guy is really good, but the United States is saying he's corrupt. Why did that happen? Again, watch that episode, because we show you that we got him fired because he happened to be investigating Burisma. But don't look at any of that. March 2016, he is fired. Then later, Joe Biden brags about his influence on Shokin's firing, saying he threatened to withhold $1 billion in aid. But everybody applauded for that time, and they shouldn't have. That was really bad. And he said, I'm going to hold this money back unless you can Shokin. Now, from 2014 to 2019, the U.S. is training the military forces. Okay, this is where we come in, and then Trump comes in and is like, look, you want to help prepare them, then we can help prepare them. By the end of 2017, Trump's first year in office, he approves the first sale of weapons to Ukraine. We're no longer giving them blankets, we're selling them Javelin missiles. That, of course, developed into a massive headache for Trump. Because what's next? Oh, he does this, and this is going to play a role a little bit later. In March 2019, Ukraine elects a new president. But that was a spontaneous election. We had nothing to do with that. Don't think about the woman handing out sandwiches. The guy they elect is a comedic actor named Volodymyr Zelensky. We know him. We love him. 2 months later, the famous phone call between Trump and Zelensky happens. And Trump pressed pause on $250 million in military aid because he's like, hey, you should be investigating Joe and Hunter Biden's activities in Ukraine. Remember, Joe Biden said you shouldn't be investigating Burisma, and everybody cheered when he held back $1 billion. This is not $1 billion, and he's saying, what is the connection there? Now, this isn't an unreasonable thing to ask, except Joe Biden is running for president at the time, so the Democrats and the media have a meltdown because how dare you? You're trying to affect the election. You're going after, his main candidate that's running against him, kind of like what the Democrats did later to Donald Trump, but pay no attention. This is all that America hears for a while. Quid pro quo. About 5 billion times over the next 5 months. That's all you hear. Several weeks later, Trump releases the aid to Ukraine, but never mind that, it doesn't matter. Democrats then impeach him in the House. Here's the phone call. The aid is released. Then they impeach Trump for alleged abuse of power. Then what happens? Well, this updated charter, remember this charter? Signed here under George W. Bush. Now we fast forward to November 2021. Biden is president now. Secretary of State Blinken signs an updated Ukrainian charter with the U.S. on a strategic partnership that has even more security promises and support for Ukraine's goal of joining NATO. Do you remember when we get down later when Trump is sitting there with Zelensky and Zelensky's like, we need more protection, we need more security. We had it there. Biden updated it. Now he wants even more. That's the problem. Who could have seen this coming? After we do that, 3 months later, Russia does a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Because, what were they saying? You cannot let them go into NATO. This is saying, we're going to let them go into NATO. And this is where Russia goes in. The U.S. money floodgates are opened all the way. According to current State Department numbers, we have given over $100 billion just in military aid to Ukraine to fight Russia. Tanks, missiles, boats, aircraft, you name it. So the war drags on. No end in sight. Nobody's even talking about peace. Then Trump returns and gets back into the White House. There, and it brings us down to April 2022, which then brings us in 2025. Within 3 weeks of this current administration, they are holding talks with Russia in Saudi Arabia. Soon after, Trump brings up a minerals deal with Ukraine. Then comes the meltdown meeting a couple of weeks ago with Zelensky in the White House, and even my own family was like, I don't understand that. He treated him like garbage. And I just said this, did you watch the whole thing? Because the first 20, 30 minutes of it, Trump is trying to cajole him, trying to joke about, yeah, I know, that's crazy, we're not going to do any of that. Tries to disarm him. And finally, after about 30 minutes, both he and J.D. Vance just snap. What are you doing? You're playing to the cameras, which is what he always does. In fact, if you remember right, when Biden had him in the White House, he said almost the same thing. Hey, treat us with some respect, because that's his MO. So when everything is in jeopardy, Trump pauses the U.S. military aid and intelligence sharing. Everybody freaks out and says, that's not going to happen. That's a disaster. They'll lose. Well, Trump knows that. And he knows that's going to bring them back to the table, which it did. Last week, a breakthrough. Secretary of State Rubio meets with Ukrainian leaders. They agreed to a 30-day ceasefire with Russia. That is, if Russia eventually agrees to the U.S. proposal. As a result of the successful talks, we resume our military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. That was just a tool with our very good negotiator. A joint statement also says the U.S. and Ukraine will conclude a deal as soon as possible to develop Ukraine's mineral resources. Russia doesn't want that because now we have stake. We have something in this game. They don't want that because now they know we don't want to lose any of that. You see how this negotiation thing is working? All of this progress over the last month toward ending the war makes you wonder, why wasn't the Biden White House willing to use the same kind of pressure tactics to stop the war? Why, it seems, that they would prefer to keep the war going? Was it their globalist priorities, including maintaining unity with NATO allies? I don't know, could be. And remember, the Biden White House signed that updated Ukrainian charter on strategic partnership. This is just a few months before Russia invaded. To be very clear, Russia's the bad guy here. Russia started all this war that has killed or wounded a combined estimated 1 million soldiers on both sides. Russia did that. But what if the 20th century NATO approach, at least in this conflict, wasn't the most efficient way to resolve it? In hindsight, had our 20th century NATO reflex not kicked in so hard after Russia invaded Ukraine, maybe Europe would have stepped up and took more of a financial burden and things would have ended up differently. I don't know. Maybe Europe would have exerted more pressure to keep Russia from starting a war in NATO's backyard. Probably not, because they have a 75-year track record of total reliance on the U.S. for their security. Now, how did that happen? I got another chalkboard. I got to turn these around. When I come back, I'm going to show you why we got involved with NATO in the first place. And then you have to ask yourself, and I don't know the answer. I know I'm beginning to form an answer, but you have to answer it yourself. Should we even be involved in NATO anymore? Is it worth it? What is it doing? We'll do that next. So apparently the head of Doge is done with NATO. Last week, Elon Musk reshared a post on X from Senator Mike Lee that read, quote, "Exit NATO now," to which Musk added, "We really should. I mean, it doesn't make sense for America to pay for the defense of Europe." True. Now, I want full disclosure here. I want you to know I'm leaning that way. I haven't completely given up on NATO, but I really think it's probably the right thing to do. But let's take this journey together. So that's a critical, radical statement. That's nuts. Get out of NATO. Well, is it nuts, or is it that sometimes furniture becomes such a part of a room that you barely notice its function anymore until somebody messes with it or tries to rearrange the room and you're like, you can't move that there. That chair has always been over here. Is NATO that chair? Has it become such a fixture over the last 75 years that we don't really notice it anymore? Nobody uses it. I mean, it's worthless. Well, let me take you back to the chalkboard, because I think most Americans don't know much about NATO other than a passing reference to it in their school history books. That is, if they taught you American history. And I want to take you through how we got to this point, because the NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Why does it matter? Does it even still matter? Here's how it started. Go back to 1948. Europe is a pile of rubble from World War II. Germany has been divided into 4 different zones here. You had the French zone. That's where all the lazy people who said, I surrender. They went there. Then you had the United States, Soviet Union, and Great Britain. So it was carved up. And inside the Soviet zone, it's also divided into 4 zones controlled by each of the allies. The Soviets decide to choke the other allies out of Berlin with a total blockade of the Western zones for the city. So the U.S. and Britain respond with the Berlin airlift. It is I think, one of the greatest things we ever did. It was round-the-clock planes dropping supplies over the western half of Berlin. That kept 2 million Berliners alive and free. The Berlin airlift involves more than 277,000 flights over 15 months, and it sends a clear, defiant message to Moscow. It lights the fuse for the Cold War, but says, "We're standing." April 1949, months before the airlift ended, representatives from 12 European nations, plus Canada, because I don't want to leave Canada out. I mean, they're cute and everything, but they're kind of like Europe's understudy, you know? They get together in Washington, D.C., and they form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The idea is really simple. We all band together for protection and help stop the spread of Soviet communism across Europe. We don't want to sit on our hands as, Poland is invaded by another, Hitler, or in this case, the Soviets. Now, the key to the whole treaty is what's called Article 5. This says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all NATO members. It's a pinky swear. It's the glue that holds NATO together. No matter if we like France or not, it doesn't matter. If somebody attacks them, we all go in together. It's what keeps more and more European nations joining NATO over the next 75 years, and it is what makes Ukraine desperate to join. Now, keep Article 5 in mind, because we're going to come back to that later. 1950, we're at the Korean War. Not everybody in the U.S. government cheers for NATO, okay? During the Senate debate, the Ohio Republican Robert Taft, who's not the guy to be confused with the so fat he had to have his own bathtub in the White House. That's a different Taft. He really opposed the treaty, and he said, quote, "This whole program, in my opinion, is not a peace program. It's a war program. The whole tendency of this program is toward a third world war instead of away from a third world war. We are inevitably starting an armament race." And it's amazing how relevant his words are right now. Is NATO actually a peace program or a war program? I don't know. Why have we chained ourselves to potentially endless fights? And at the end, very least, to endless funding for the protection of others. I mean, I'm all for, hey, let's all help each other out, but that's not the way it is. Alliances can be really important, but they also can drag you into quicksand. The first big NATO test arrives a year later when North Korea explodes. North Korea, supplied by the Soviets, storm into South Korea, and NATO realizes the Cold War could turn hot at any moment in Europe. So the U.S. is the urgent driver of the NATO military buildup. Troops, tanks, planes, bases, and a real game plan. We go in there. But by 1951, they have to set up something called SHAPE. This is when that's established. I didn't even know about this until my researchers were like, hello, SHAPE, dummy. And I'm like, yeah, I know about SHAPE. I didn't know anything about SHAPE. It stands for Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. And it was in Paris. SHAPE would be the nerve center of NATO. Now, why didn't I know that? Because the headquarters are not in Paris. Where are they? Where are they? They're in Brussels, right? That's not France. Listen, 1955, a game-changing move. West Germany joins NATO. It's incredible. Just a decade after the Allies took down the Nazis, now half of the old Germany joins NATO. And that means rearming Germany, which France hates. And I might say this time for good reason. They think it's way too soon to be giving Germans weapons. But the U.S. presses ahead with the plan, insisting that it is necessary to have a buffer against Soviet aggression. Adding West Germany to NATO then triggers the Iron Curtain and sets the whole Cold War map in stone. West versus East, with everyone's finger on the button. There's a lot of freaking out right now about President Trump threatening to pull out of NATO. But there is a precedent for it. France. How do we not know this story? Maybe you do, but I didn't. 1966, France withdraws from NATO. President Charles de Gaulle pulls out of NATO's military structure. Why? Because he's sick of, there's no reason why America should kill all the shots. You never win a war. We do. I don't know, maybe you should shut the pie hole. He's trying to reassert France's sovereignty. He says, we do not want to be a U.S. puppet. Huh? This means no NATO troops in France, no NATO bases. SHAPE has to move from Paris to Belgium. France technically stays part of the North Atlantic Treaty, just no military. How convenient for France, isn't it? We're still there. In case somebody comes and tries to hit us in the nose, maybe you could send a jet over or something. France doesn't rejoin the military side of NATO until 2009. Okay, spoiler alert. The Soviet Union implodes in 1991. Cold War is over. That was the purpose of NATO. Why is it still happening 40 years after? It stopped everything for 40 years. We never fired a shot. It was good. But then, 1994 and civil war in Bosnia, NATO intervenes with airstrikes, try to stop the bloodbath, enforce a no-fly zone. It was declared by the UN Security Council. Oh, that's going to work out well. In 1999, NATO steps into a conflict in Yugoslavia, dropping bombs in Serbia to stop the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. Then, September 11th, 2001. For the first time in history, NATO history, NATO invokes Article 5. An attack on the U.S. is an attack on all NATO countries. NATO is suddenly part of the global war on terror. That's the history of NATO in a nutshell. So what is Vladimir Putin's beef with NATO? Where does that come from? Well, you have to go back to the 1990s when the Soviet Union dies. Vladimir Putin, ever notice when he walks, the hand where his gun used to be doesn't swing? He walks like this because the guy was KGB, all right? Part of Putin's soul dies a little bit when the Soviet Union dies. He's a career KGB guy. He's stationed in East Germany. Oh, and you will talk. When the Berlin Wall comes down, he thinks that's a mistake. By the end of the decade, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland join NATO. And then the worst of all, from Putin's standpoint, the former Soviet states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania also joined NATO in 2004. Putin sees this and he's like, this is the West. This is NATO marching right into Russia, right in our front yard and pitching a tent and saying, dare us. He thinks the fall of the Soviet Union was a mistake, but he also resents NATO. It has been simmering since the end of the Cold War, still simmering today, because when the wall came down, George H.W. Bush promised, we're never going to have NATO move your direction. And then it happens over and over and over again. And as Putin said recently, why should I believe you're not going to? At a summit in April of 2008, NATO agrees to eventually make the former Soviet state of Georgia a full member of NATO. 4 months later, Russia invades Georgia. NATO condemns the invasion, has plenty of meetings about it, but it's now kind of becoming a little like the UN. Nobody does anything because Georgia's not a NATO member. Putin was testing the waters for his next move in 2014. He snatched Crimea from Ukraine. NATO ramps up the rhetoric again. We do nothing. He just keeps going. NATO doesn't do anything. See, this is why you don't draw little lines in the sand and then let them cross and you erase that line. You say, well, don't cross this one, okay? Again, no direct fight because NATO hasn't had Ukraine as a member. Putin wants it to stop, to keep it that way, to stop that from happening. That brings us back to 2025. President Trump is now stirring the pot. He's so reckless with NATO, and he's making all the allies squirm with his posture towards Ukraine. Is the NATO alliance valuable to us? Should we be involved in the NATO alliance when it comes to places like Ukraine or Latvia? Can you find it on a map? Or, and it might be important, or is it a chain that is dragging America into somebody else's war? Senator Robert Taft, remember him? 1949. Is it a peace program or is it a war program? Done a lot of good. Is it still